All right, so as we get ready to transition from talking about discrimination into our next unit, which is a unit where we're going to look at early American wars, we want to look very briefly here at just kind of the concept of war in general. What you're going to be doing if you're in person is you are going to be part of a group that is going to explore one of the 5 early American wars: the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, or the Spanish-American War. If you're at home, you're going to do a little bit of an exploration of each one of those wars to help you get an understanding of what's going on. What we want to do though is look at really what all wars have in common. What things we can look at and say this is something that is pretty common across the particular spectrums of any war, right? American wars or wars that we'll see in other places. Once we get done looking at these early American wars, what we're going to do is then look at World War I, kind of as a combined group, to see just how that conflict is going to shape the 1920s in this country, how it's going to influence the Great Depression, and then ultimately how it sets up World War II, which will be kind of the big event that we start next semester with. So let's take a look just at this idea of war. Human beings are the only species on the planet that goes to war. Think about that, right? You don't see, the aardvarks and the anteaters getting really tore up that one of them comes before the other in the dictionary, and so they go to war. But human beings do it quite a bit. I read something once talking about in all of the 5,000-6,000 years of recorded human history, there are less than 300 years where there's not some type of war that's happening somewhere in the world. And so it certainly does seem to be a part of the human condition. And wars can be fought for a variety of different reasons. A lot of times it's power. It's the desire to preserve power or to take power away. Right? If we look at the Revolutionary War, this is a war about, among other things, power. The British had power over the colonies. The colonies didn't appreciate the way that power was being used and wanted to take that power for themselves. You can see wars being fought over territory. A piece of land that is in between 2 particular countries. Both of them have a claim to it, and so they'll fight for their interest as far as that goes, right? We look at something like the War of 1812, and believe it or not, we had our eye on Canada, or some people in the United States did. That hockey and round bacon looked really appealing, and so you've got wars that get fought that way. We also have wars of protection. If you look at something like the war in Afghanistan, the Second War in Iraq, part of kind of what they called the larger war against terrorism was this idea that we need to go fight in these places because if we fight in these places, it's going to allow us to protect our homeland in a better way. Most wars, though, are fought. Old wars, modern wars are fought to preserve something called the status quo. And the status quo is simply a way of saying the way things are. And so usually in at least one side of a conflict in the war, one of the groups that's fighting wants to keep things the way that they are, right? The British want to keep the American colonies. The South in the Civil War wants to keep slavery in the United States or in their part in their states. And so it's kind of fought to preserve that. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at it, even though these wars are fought to preserve the status quo, nothing changes things more than warfare. If we were to look at a timeline of all of human history and put the big events there, you would see clouds of big events popping up around wars. Wars drive invention, innovation, and not just in the technology of war, and we'll talk about that in a second, but in things like medicine, the treatment of injuries. Some of the things that come out of warfare, then our technologies are transformed for civilian uses. And so everything, even though wars are fought to keep things the same, they change things more than pretty much any other event in our history. And so as we start to look at these wars, that's another thing to ask yourself: what changes are coming around because of what we see in these wars? So, like I said, wars are fought to keep things the same, but nothing is going to change things. So circumstances of war, right? What kinds of things do we look at? One of the things we're going to ask you to do is explore the causes of these wars, as well as the effects. What happens after the war? How do things change because of this? You can see technological circumstances that will lead to war. Political, definitely. Religious, right? If you remember back to world history, looking at some of those wars in England between the Catholics and the Protestants, right? Usually it was about political power, somebody coming to the throne of England, but that political power is butting up against religious beliefs between those two groups. An awful lot of warfare is economic, right? A group has a resource that another group wants. And so they'll end up trying to take it. We see demographic wars. I know many of you saw the movie Hotel Rwanda when you were in the 7th grade. If you haven't seen it, guess where there's a copy conveniently located for you. That's right, the film library. But if you remember that, right, it's in Rwanda. There were these two tribes of people, and one tribe just basically had decided this other tribe doesn't deserve to live. And so you get fighting over demographics. Sometimes it's just geographic. You've got people that are neighbors, and neighbors are going to naturally butt heads over borders, resources, things like that. And so you see an awful lot of those things. So I want to encourage you, as we look at some of these early wars, to think about some of these factors to see what may be causing what's happening there. One other thing we're going to ask you to look at as you explore this are the instruments of war, how people are going to fight. Because when you think about warfare, what you got to think about is what makes one people or person stronger than another. Right? I'm a pretty big guy. Got some martial arts training. If I was to take on someone who is much smaller than me, not as strong as me, I could physically overpower them. And so the power in that circumstance is going to be, me just being able to physically dominate whoever that person is. Well, if that person wanted to kind of even the odds a little bit, right, what could they do? We saw this in Far and Away with our buddies Joseph and Shannon. And she's not going to take Joseph. Dude punches horses for fun, right? But she grabs that pitchfork. And so now all of a sudden she's in a position of power, because it doesn't matter how much physical strength he has. She has this tool that kind of evens the odds. And then what we're going to see is tools being created specifically for warfare. And that's another thing we're going to ask you to take a look at in your particular war, are the types of weapons that are being used. And as we see the transition between these wars, you're going to see how those things improved, how tactics had to change because of this increased technology. You look and you see, like the guns people were using in the Revolutionary War period, right? Smoothbore muskets, one shot, every 25 seconds, 25 seconds, to modern machine guns that are going to be used in World War I. Well, you can't have that difference in weapons and not have to change tactics in what you're using. So as you start to explore these things, that's really what we want you to look at. Kind of dig into these wars, but notice as you see these other wars being presented, kind of where this stuff started from and how the evolution of weapons happened, how the evolution of tactics happened, what happens to the country as they go through these individual wars. How are things changing? How's that status quo changing as we look at all of these different early American wars? Got a great video for you on the playlist. If you're in class, we're going to take a look at it. But if you're home, get the first few minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey that's there. Now, as you watch it, you're going to think it's a little trippy. The whole movie, of course, is available in the film library. But take a look and see if you can connect what's going on there to what we're talking about here with the circumstances of war.